so young. Hopefully, they do not spoil themselves. Spoil themselves, Your Majesty? Queen Auriculus nodded. The way they run off on their own like that is indicative of their upbringing. From the day they are born, nobles are cared for by their mother or at least a wet nurse. As soon as they can walk, they are surrounded by a battery of tutors, attendants, security personnel and so on. Some are not even allowed to sleep alone until they find employ in another household or are married off. A noble scion is not their own individual, neither are they allowed much freedom. The moment freedom presents itself, they tend to run off like Wagner and Garnier just did. What are we going on about? As a butler, you should already be well aware of this. Sabos very certainly wasn't, despite being a butler. Over his time amongst the citizens of the world that Nazarick and its denizens had found themselves in, he had learned that many concepts assumed to be shared between them were, in reality, quite dissimilar. Of those concepts, butler and maid were two that he had taken the time to carefully study, both out of professional and personal interest. From what he had learned, a butler was originally a household servant who was something like a cupbearer. It was a position that, over time, had evolved into one of stewardship over a household and its affairs as the chief of staff. In all but the rarest of exceptions, a butler was an aristocrat, usually a spare with the appropriate rank and professional qualifications for the position. Those qualifications included a mountain of things that Sabos had no idea about, as well as many things that he was not proficient at, so he did his best to keep conversations with outsiders from flowing in problematic directions while he did his best to familiarize himself with those subjects for the future. Familiarization, however, was easier said than done. Everything aside from the basics appeared to be beyond his capability to grasp. Additionally, he discovered that Albedo was actually doing what the locals considered a butler's job as Nazarick's guardian overseer. So, not only was it difficult to learn a butler's trade, but he also felt guilty over the idea that he was learning tasks that the supreme beings had assigned to someone else. It felt like theft and blasphemy combined. Yet, it seemed essential in the duties assigned to him. He was Sebastian, the royal butler. Not knowing what was required for that esteemed position would bring shame to himself and the name of Ainzulgaon. Though it pained him to admit it, the fact that nearly all of Queen Auricula's senior palace staff had been killed, eaten, or both spared him an incalculable amount of awkwardness. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention to the barge's ramp. After several moments, Minister Sorul appeared, her pale white shawl fluttering in the wind. Captain Insera's men have secured the subjects Your Majesty requested. They are being conveyed to Castle Corin. I've instructed some of the temple staff that we brought with us to conduct an examination. In that case, Queen Auriculus replied, let's be on our way. Thank you, Sorul. Sabos accompanied the queen and her ministers down the ramp, eyeing the crowded wharf. They entered the carriages that had been brought along from Oraculon, and Sabos found himself sitting beside the queen across from Prime Minister Yorstin, Minister Sorul, and Marshal Zalu. Countess Corlin was on the other side of the queen. If I may ask, Your Majesty, Sabos said, who are the subjects Minister Sorul mentioned? We requested a set of subjects afflicted by Lera-related conditions to varying degrees, Queen Auriculus replied. The people near Rivergarden were only exposed to it for days at most, so there was little to be done but wait out the short-term effects. According to Captain Zaradnik's reports, the condition of the people is especially severe in the area around Corin on the lake. We must see what can be done to treat them. I see. Is that why Your Majesty insisted on coming here so quickly? Amongst several other matters, yes. We hope you will indulge our selfishness. We are at your service, Your Majesty. The Queen's request came with greater risks, but not to the point that the royal army considered the move unacceptable. More concerning to Sabos was the subtle shift that he sensed in the Queen's demeanor over the past week. Now, a storm seemed to swirl behind her dark gaze and he didn't know what to make of it. Their carriage slowly negotiated its way through the crowds of busy workers, and a rare break filled the cabin with sunlight. In front of him, Marshal Zalu stifled a yawn with his hand. Queen Auricula's gaze went between the marshal and the minister on his left. You appear pleased at Zalu's development, Sorul. Why, Your Majesty? Minister Sorul released Marshal Zalu's elbow. A mischievous smile crossed the Queen's lips. The young woman visibly relented. I'm sure that the Marshal is more pleased with his own development than I am, Minister Sorul said. He couldn't come close to besting me in combat before. Now, he might be stronger than I am. Sabos glanced at the ornately hilted blade at the minister's knee. Despite her appearance, or perhaps it was the cause of her appearance, Salacia Sorul was a respectably strong bard by local standards. Apparently, she was instrumental in the defense of the palace before the Sorceress Kingdom's arrival, bolstering the spirits of the palace staff with her skills and even slaying a handful of beastmen. Zalu limps around enough to cause one to wonder whether he is pleased about it or not, the queen said. Zalu will be fine, Minister Sorul said. It is the god's will that humanity strives to improve itself. Zalu is sitting right here, the marshal muttered. Speaking of the god's will, Queen Auriculus said, have you thought further on what was discussed the other day? Minister Sorul looked down at the hands folded over her knees with a solemn expression. I'm not sure what to think, Your Majesty, she said. The Draconic Kingdom has relied on the theocracy's goodwill for generations. That goodwill came with a number of crippling stipulations, the Queen noted. The implications of which should not be lost on you. I know, Your Majesty. Still, must it be this way? Those stipulations also came with a number of undeniable benefits. One could say that we would not be the same country without them. He had no idea what they were referring to. Though he attended the Queen while the sundry tasks of the court were being taken care of, there were still many things that went on behind closed doors. I wonder about that, Marshal Zalu said. It was a satisfactory arrangement in the past, but that arrangement has remained unchanged since before Her Majesty ascended the throne. For generations, our country structured itself around its dependence on the theocracy. We had an agreement. They broke it, not us. It is a painful lesson. What was a matter of survival to us was merely a matter of convenience to them. The marshal gestured to the cabin window with a hand. This is what their inconvenience means for us. It was something we had to suffer before, but not anymore. There is no point to our arrangement if they do not have the strength to uphold it. Queen Auriculus cleared her throat. To be fair, they do, but certain international conventions prohibit them from deploying that strength. What they have available in lieu of those conventions is likely insufficient to deal with our current problem, which is why they didn't come this time around. That is effectively the same thing, Marshal Zalu said. Unless Your Majesty means to imply that they will deploy that strength against us if we become inconvenient in a different sense. This is the crux of the matter, I suppose, the Prime Minister said. Pardon the interruption, Sabos raised a hand, but I appear to be missing the background to this conversation. The Sorceress Kingdom is unaware of the fine points of the Draconic Kingdom's arrangement with the slain theocracy and what problems our intervention may cause. The Queen leaned back in her seat, placing a hand on Sabos' knee. Forgive us, Sabos, she said. We are simply addressing some outstanding deliberations. We weren't aware that Countess Corlin didn't brief you on this prickly aspect of our diplomacy. I wasn't sure it was the case, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin said. Dealing with parties in a superior position tends toward that party directly demanding or at least implying that their interests should be protected by anyone that they are dealing with. Unlike the countries in the north that you are already familiar with, Lord Sabos, the slain theocracy is just that, a theocracy. Their policies will always be in line with the mandates of their faith, and the faith of the Six in the slain theocracy has taken a highly aggressive turn in the last century or so. Queen Auriculus nodded. A dependency on the theocracy means that we must also respect that policy. Otherwise, they simply withhold their assistance. That limits the Draconic Kingdom's meaningful diplomacy to human countries. Roble has its own problems and Riestais would bankrupt itself if it ever tried sending some sort of army here. The Empire sees no profit in sending aid and the current Emperor seems to despise female rulers. Rumor has it that he believes that women have no place in politics or leadership at all. That leaves the isolationist Wyvern Rider tribes, the human powers in the Koshi belt over 2,000 kilometers to the south, and the slain theocracy. We suppose we could have goaded that Decimane of Asher into displaying his elven superiority, but the theocracy has been on bad terms with him for a while now. Doesn't the Draconic Kingdom have hundreds of treaties with nearby aquatic demi-human polities? Countess Corlin asked. I would have thought the theocracy would take issue with that. Aquatic demi-humans are much lower on the threat scale for the theocracy, the Queen answered. They don't compete for the same territory, so the theocracy sees more benefit in us being able to fish in peace and breed more humans for them. As you may know, any terrestrial demi-human tribe is kept in a primitive state by the theocracy's regional enforcers. It seemed that Yggdrasil wasn't the only existence where humans caused no end of trouble. Now that he thought about it, their master was certain of player presence or at least influence in the slain theocracy, so it may have been humans from Yggdrasil affecting human attitudes in the region. I suppose that our intervention will cause unwanted friction between the theocracy and the Draconic Kingdom, then. It will, but you are here and they are not. How they will react to the Sorceress Kingdom's influence when they learn of it is unknown, but that is a problem to be discussed after the current crisis is resolved. Their procession followed the road up into Castle Corin, where hasty preparations had been made for the Queen's arrival. Sabos scanned the battlements and rooftops as they made their way to a long building to the side of the main keep. A young man in priestly garb lowered his head as they entered the door. "Will your Majesty be seeing the patients now?" "Yes. How are they?" The priest turned to lead them down a side hall. "Outwardly," he said, "there are few direct signs of being under the poison's effects. Secondary effects, however, are plentiful. The euphoria brought about by the poison is such that one can neglect their health, foregoing food, sleep and personal hygiene. Needless to say, work and family activities are also neglected. I will spare your Majesty the exact details, but it did need to be stated." "How long do the effects last?" Minister Sorrel asked. "Apparently, this plant is different from the one that we've received information about." "We don't know yet," the priest shook his head. "All we know is that the people dosed with the narcotic in the river garden area were still poisoned by the time we left for Corin on the lake. Since it may last a week or more, trying to keep people from poisoning themselves again would be best done by keeping areas with tainted water sources off limits." "What about magical sources? The ones for this city, for instance?" "We've tested those and they're safe, Your Excellency. The volume of water conjured by those items is nowhere near enough for the rural population, however." Minister Sorrel sighed. "We're not lacking in space," she said, "but moving so many people is going to be a nightmare, especially in their state." "Did the advisory issued by the royal court not state that not every settlement was affected?" "It did," Minister Sorrel replied, "but even if only a quarter of the settlements have thoroughly tainted water sources, that's still 500,000 people to deal with. What in the world were the beastmen thinking when they did this?" "Going by what the people in the area related to us," Prime Minister Yostin said, "they may not have known about the long-term effects. Our citizens were being managed as livestock, and a farmer doesn't poison their own livestock. Especially not livestock that's supposed to tend to itself." The first patient was an emaciated young man dressed in simple garb. As the priest had mentioned, he seemed perfectly normal aside from the fact he was so thin. It took him a moment to realize they were there, at which point he rose to his feet with a nervous expression. His mouth opened, then closed, and he settled on silently bobbing his head in greeting. Sabos thought back to his time in Riestais. How many people resembled the man before him? The city folk, especially, lived in impoverished conditions, so telling an addict apart from a healthy person was nearly impossible. People would take it to distract themselves from the daily troubles that they ultimately couldn't do anything about. The Queen stepped forward, uncaring of the lack of proper address. She smiled up at the young man. "What is your name?" she asked. "Kest." "Thank you for coming, Kest. You may be seated, if you wish." The man sat back down. Queen Auriculus remained where she stood. "Do you know who I am?" Kest seemed to struggle with the question. After several seconds, he nodded. "How do you feel, now?" the Queen asked. What happened?" Queen Auriculus sent a pointed look in the priest's direction. He came forward to examine the patient. "He's healthy. Aside from the malnutrition, I don't sense anything wrong about him." "In that case," the Queen turned around, "make sure Kest gets a good meal. Let's take a look at the next patient." They left the room with its somewhat bewildered occupant. The priest went ahead to check on the next patient. When the door to the room opened again, they entered to find a young woman in a similar physical condition. The woman, however, didn't react to their appearance, staring blankly at the wall at the foot of her bed. "Apologies, Your Majesty," the priest said. "The patient is not very responsive." "How many are like this?" "Most of the village is relying on wells for water. This woman is from a village 3 kilometers southwest of the city." I'm afraid to say everyone there was in the same condition or worse. As the priest spoke, the woman's stare turned toward them. A tear ran down her cheek, and she flipped around and buried herself under her covers. The priest turned around to find the quivering pile on the bed behind him. An occasional sob from the woman leaked through. Sabos frowned. What was going on? The patients were being cured, but the telltale effects of healing magic were absent. Once the priest confirmed the woman's healthy condition, they entered the hallway again. When the priest stopped to open the door across the corridor, the queen spoke. I am already done with that one, she said. Next. The priest drew his hand back from the latch and led them further along. In the next room lay another young woman. A basket lay on the chair beside her bed. Minister Sorul sniffled and dabbed at her cheek with a handkerchief as she looked down at the infant within. Since this is a natural poison, the priest said, the young are especially vulnerable to the way that it was distributed. Much like alcohol poisoning, the mass of the individual ingesting the substance matters, and growing children consume a higher percentage of their mass in food and drink. The effects on their physical and mental development. His words trailed into a despondent sigh. A cry rose from the basket. Find someone to take care of the child, Queen Auriculus said. The priest examined the child, and then his mother. The child is healthy now, but the mother. I will see to her later, Queen Auriculus said. Lunch awaits. They left the castle's makeshift ward, heading back outside and making their way to the keep. The skies had clouded over again, threatening them with an imminent downpour. If I may ask, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin said. Was that wild magic? Yes. I apologize for its lack of impressiveness. A part of me thinks that tear magic comes with all of its flashiness for entertainment purposes. Will you be healing all of your people the same way? Honestly, it comes as a relief. We thought there was a humanitarian disaster on the Draconic Kingdom's hands. You saw it just now, yes? Queen Auriculus replied, 4 is my limit. If millions require healing. If wild magic took as long as mana to recover, it would take many lifetimes to heal so many. She possessed the power to alter reality itself, yet she couldn't alter enough of it. So one wouldn't be able to tell if wild magic is being employed at all, Your Majesty? Sabos asked. That depends, the Queen answered. The presence of superfluous effects that others can detect is entirely dependent on the caster. Since it is true sorcery, how the caster visualizes the spell has a real effect on how it appears. Some of the more common examples of this are special attacks. Since a dragon's mind naturally thinks of a breath attack as a special attack, many of those wild magic attacks manifest as breath attacks even though they don't strictly need to be. In that case, Sabos said, wouldn't wild magic be excellent for combat? Tear magic spells usually always come with cues that warn their targets about what is happening. Tear magic has a similar issue as the one I mentioned before. Mana, as it is commonly called, is not primordial energy that is required to manifest in any particular way. Primordial energies associated with water must manifest into water-associated environmental effects or water spirits like elementals and nereids. However, before it is used, mana is simply mana. Formless. A resource consumed to produce results based on certain formulas. A brace of magic arrows could just have easily become a ward against evil or a basket of bread. What mana can become is dependent on the caster. One can run out of mana, Your Majesty, Sabos noted. There are ways around that, the Queen said. Just as there are with wild magic. They ascended to the 3rd floor of the keep's central tower, where a table set with dishes and utensils awaited them. Along one side of the great hall, Baroness Zaradnik stood at a narrow slit, gazing down at the city. Captain Zaradnik, the Queen smiled brightly. We are pleased that you could make it. Were you able to meet with Marshal Sa'ukanyan? I was, Your Majesty. The Baroness dipped into a curtsy as the Queen walked up to her. His Excellency expressed his pleasure over our progress and hopes to make some of his own over the next few weeks. The citizens of Fortune Bay are similarly elated over recent developments. Did you find out how Fortune Bay survived for so long, Captain? Marshal Zalo asked. I heard that at least one of the beastmen that participated in the retaliation against Crystal Tear was actively fighting in the southern provinces. Since that was the case, our people shouldn't have stood any chance. Optics, probably, Queen Auriculus said with a sour look. It is as Her Majesty says, the Baroness nodded. Blazing crimson, along with several other worker and adventurer teams, kept the beastmen at bay until the city ran out of valuables to pay them with. After that happened, the workers remained for long enough to acquire several galleons to carry their earnings away. Over 80% of the adventurers in the city went with them. In that case, how did Fortune Bay survive afterwards? Certain precedents had already been set, which the then General Saul Karnian took full advantage of. The local shark folk secured the bay while His Excellency went on the offensive, putting on a show of strength that the beastmen had no choice but to respect. By taking the fight to the beastmen and wreaking havoc on their civilian population, all thought and energy were drawn away from the city. The man is a shrewd strategist. It seems like demi-humans are more reliable allies than the theocracy, Marshal Zulu grumbled. I hear it was much the same in the Holy Kingdom of Roblé, Baroness Saradnik said. Riestais declined their entreaties for aid despite being a human country sharing the same coastline, but the local aquatic demi-humans helped Roblé's Royal Navy resist Yaldabaoth's attempts to push into the south. Sabos' moustache shifted slightly at Lady Zaradnik's rendition of events in the Holy Kingdom, but he was forced to admit that it wasn't explicitly a lie. As despicable as his methods were, Demiurge's actions had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing the true nature of people. Unfortunately, those that demonstrated a steadfast, goodly nature were purposely targeted for disposal unless Demiurge intended to use them to further his evil schemes. Those that he left behind were fragile, weak-minded and rife with problematic behaviors, slowing and even undermining any attempts at a proper recovery. Once a proud bastion of good, the Holy Kingdom of Roblé was now a hollow shell of itself, its foundations shattered and its people vulnerable to the Archdevil's manipulation. Even now, he was working to create a state of permanent dependency on the Sorcerer's Kingdom, and the finest of the Holy Kingdom goods were being offered up for humanitarian aid composed of grain that the Sorcerer's Kingdom couldn't otherwise get rid of even if they offered it for free. Their master mandated the candy and the whip in their approach to the peoples of the region, but Demiurge always made sure that the candy was offered in a dish placed inside a cage. In nearly every way, the Sorceress Kingdom's efforts in the Draconic Kingdom were the complete opposite of what was going on in Roblé. Yet, even without any machinations on Nazarik's part, Sabos knew that it was merely another large-scale experiment in the eyes of Nazarik's greatest minds. Even so, it had to succeed. To show beyond the shadow of a doubt to Nazarik's denizens that this way was the right way. Are we late? A voice came from the entrance to the hall. Are you late? Baroness Saradnik asked. We didn't mean it, I swear, Countess Wagner said. Florian was distracted by a stray cat. We did not specify a time, Queen Auriculus said. Come, there is much to discuss. They settled down around the table, with Sabos attending to them as has become customary. After a few weeks of being far too busy with their other duties, the palace staff relinquished most of the physical duties of footman to him. And it was just as well, as he quickly lost any sense of the matters being discussed over the meal. That was at least until Queen Auriculus made a certain request. Captain Zaradnik. We would attend the reconquest of Eastwatch. Sabos froze. Every hand moving at their plate stopped. This is a considerable risk to take, Your Majesty, Baroness Saradnik replied. I highly doubt this is the case, but this is hardly the time for the rashness of youth to surface. A queen has duties to fulfill. None of those duties requires her to take the field. There may have been a premise if it was the Draconic Kingdom's royal army fighting the battle, but Your Majesty will have no effect on the undead. A queen's duties, Queen Auriculus murmured. I take it that you and the members of Countess Corlin's delegation understand the Draconic Kingdom's script. Around the table, the heads of the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation nodded. The queen stood, picking up a brush beside her. She dipped it in the provided inkwell and her hand moved in the sharp strokes of the Draconic Kingdom's script as she wrote on a fresh piece of paper. She held up the result. What does this say? She asked. Draconic Kingdom, Countess Corlin said. Are you sure about that? Countess Corlin exchanged looks with the other nobles from the Sorceress Kingdom. Queen Auriculus smirked and used her hand to cover a portion of her writing. What does this say? Country. The queen's hand moved. And this? Dragon. Her hand moved again. King, Countess Corlin said. So is it Draconic Kingdom or Dragon King country? Is there a difference, Your Majesty? A country ruled by a king is a kingdom. Draconic kingdom is simply mortal willfulness. The desire to define and shape things according to one's perception, regardless of the truth. This behavior also means that individuals and even countries are not defined according to their true qualities, but by what others perceive them as. It is not Draconic Kingdom - it is Dragon Lord country. Mine, to be precise. In many languages around the world, the Lord in Dragon Lord is synonymous with King. Dragon Lord and Dragon King are the same thing in Draconic. Because many cultural groups have principalities, kingdoms, empires and the like, collective perception becomes warped according to those societal constructs. Warped to the point where even the way that the world translates speech adopts the new label. That is why my domain ends up being called the Draconic Kingdom. I believe that I understand what your majesty is saying, Countess Corlin said, but this country is a kingdom and you are a queen, yes? No, Queen Auriculus said. I am queen in the sense that a female ruler may be called a queen. What I truly am, however, has always been one thing, a dragon lord. The Draconic Kingdom is not a kingdom at all, it is the land of a dragon king. In other words, it is the domain of a dragon lord. In that case, what is the name of this dragon king county? Zaradnik, I believe you know a dragon. I do, your majesty. Did she name her domain? No, your majesty. I bet you ended up naming it for her, anyway. Yes, your majesty. More for convenience and legal matters than anything else. Queen Auriculus set down the piece of paper with a smirk. And there you have it, she said. Dragons feel no need to name their domains, they just are. It is others that come up with names for them. This name that the region has come up with for my domain would be very confusing elsewhere in the world, by the way. There are a lot of draconic kingdoms out there. But your majesty's system of government shares many similarities to ours, Countess Wagner pointed out. Enough to believe that it is the same form of government or close enough. Do you believe that this form of government simply popped out of the nothingness that the demon gods left behind? Queen Auriculus arched an eyebrow. It is older than you probably think. So what's used in the north is just a copy of something else. Your system is pieced together out of the remnants of a much older system. That system is merely an imitation of an ancient system. One designed for powerful immortals. It is not meant for mortals, which is why you see the problems that you do in mortal domains, which brings me to my own problems. The queen emptied her goblet of wine and took a deep breath before continuing. As a dragon lord, I have certain duties. I have tried explaining what those duties are to others before, but that has only resulted in confusion, scorn, or both. There is one thing that I believe most would understand in part, however. As Dragon Lord, I must defend my domain from what is detrimental to the souls under my care, and dragons defend their domains personally. Is that why you've become so aggressive recently? Baroness Zaradnik asked. That's right, Queen Auriculus answered. Wait a minute, Countess Wagner said. Your people have been preyed on by the beastmen for the gods know how long. Yet, when they bring out the Lera, it's suddenly a problem. Dragon Lords understand that the world does not exist at the convenience of any single race. Not every soul is equal in the eyes of the world, but every soul should be allowed to write their own story. Things like Lera interfere with that. And things like getting eaten don't? Death is a part of life, Countess. But they're your people, Baroness Conye said. From a dragon's perspective, the Queen said, the beastmen drawing sustenance from the denizens of my domain are also my people. I'm pretty sure they don't see it that way, Countess Wagner muttered. Probably not, Queen Auriculus smirked. Dragons being attacked and killed by beings living in their domains is not rare. It happens quite often when giants are involved. Do your subjects know about this, Stance? Countess Corlin asked. The Prime Minister, Minister, and Marshal nodded. I know it seems strange to you, Prime Minister Yostin said, but ours is a country that is meant to be a part of this world. It is not like the other human countries in the region that seek to dominate everything that they can and impose human order. We are more akin to Argland than Slain, Riastais or Baharuth. So your majesty wishes to be at Eastwatch because you are acting to defend your domain? Lady Zaradnik asked. For too long now, Queen Auriculus looked down at the table. I have been hesitant to act as a dragon lord should. But, now, I must. What I am asking for is your help to do what needs to be done. Silence settled over the table. After several moments, Baroness Saradnik's eyes went past Queen Auriculus to Sabos. For the first time since his misadventure in Riastais, he found that he had been presented with an important choice. Helping those in need as a matter of course was what he wanted to say, but blindly using the justification had gotten him into trouble before. More importantly, it had inconvenienced his master. Draudilin Auriculus was a good person. As a sovereign, she genuinely cared for her subjects and her people loved her in return. If asked for a report on the Draconic Kingdom, that's what he would have said. But that sort of thing mattered little to individuals such as Demiurge and Albedo. In fact, it might have encouraged Demiurge to abduct the queen and transform her into an experimental subject while turning the Draconic Kingdom into another oblate. Over time, however, he started to see things that would hold practical value for the Sorceress Kingdom, things that Baroness Gonnier insisted had been there from the beginning. Now their discussion had turned up several more definitive points. As Prime Minister Yostin had stated, there was a problem with the human countries in the vicinity of Iranthal. They all possessed a certain character, a sort of belligerent ambition. Sabos did not doubt that Demiurge could exploit that character to achieve the reprehensible processes that he used to facilitate his means. His machinations toward them were likely already in effect, but it didn't change the fact that it was fundamentally incompatible with Einzulgaun's vision for the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The ends justifying the means was a fallacy when those means would mar the ends achieved. The Draconic Kingdom, however, was the first country that was highly compatible with the Sorcerer's Kingdom and its ideological goals. Furthermore, it was a crucial example of how a country could be won over through goodwill and diplomacy to become a valuable member of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's hegemony. They had to maintain everything that made it what it was. It would be irresponsible to say that the Queen's safety is absolutely guaranteed, he said, but I will do what little that I can to help. In that case, Baroness Saradnik said, the Royal Army will accommodate your Majesty's request. Queen Auriculus turned a thankful smile up at him. Sabos steeled himself to see his decision through. For the sake of all that was good, the Sorceress Kingdom's mission in the Draconic Kingdom had to succeed. 28th day, Middle Wind Month, 1 CE. I had really hoped to return here under better circumstances. You know, every other time you say something like that, unbelievably stupid shit happens to the place in question. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. Jaraka picked his teeth with a fishbone. Remember that one of Ariel Palace in the Heavenly Dragon Lord's southwestern valleys? A few weeks after we left, it got crushed by that eldritch horror whose name you can't even say without going insane. Then the Dragon Lord's defense fleet vaporized it and everything around it because it was the only way to be sure. That one shouldn't count, Soraka said. What were the chances of that? What are the chances of this? Soraka sighed. What were the chances, indeed? According to the foremost experts on the subject, sufficient quantities of negative energy would gather and form the beginnings of an ecology that was best described as a karmic inversion, echo, or dark reflection of the living world. Before anything as substantial as a skeleton or a zombie appeared, it was simply ambient energy, a form of primal mana that functioned similarly to elemental mana or the energies of life. Like all those other primal forces, it could naturally be found anywhere. Unlike those other primal forces, it was generated by specific actions, emotions, and states of being enacted and experienced by the living. Generally speaking, actions that accrued negative karma resulted in negative energy. As the voracious undead were one of the states of existence, one could say that they were a manifestation of negative karma. A lot of negative energy could accumulate without anyone noticing. If anyone noticed it, the situation had already become critical. Most things stopped thriving. The growth of many plants became stunted or twisted and living beings felt a distinct sense of unease. Living organisms that were sensitive to imbalances in primal mana or preferred certain mana conditions died out or left the area. The land slowly lost its ability to counterbalance the generation of negative energy and the problems associated with it accelerated as a result. For the careless, or those that simply didn't care, it was a trap all too easily sprung. Tombs, cemeteries, barrows and other ceremonial burial grounds could develop into negative energy strongholds if maintenance efforts wavered. Poorly chosen battlegrounds could invert into negative energy zones over the course of a single minor war. There were no good battlegrounds, in some cases. The expansive tundra of the far south was one such place. No matter how careful the people were, The pooling of negative energy seemed unstoppable over the centuries. Now it was called the Dreadlands, and the strip of nations along its length had become the Crusader states that were locked in an eternal battle to drive back the icy advance of the undead. Even in much better conditions, a negative energy inversion could occur. The Silent City was one such place postulated for it to have happened. Before its fall, it was a lawless metropolis ruled by crime lords and evil aristocrats, and its country was in such a state of ruthless anarchy that historians speculated that the accumulated negative energy imploded all at once to form the three Soul Eaters that wiped it out. Normally, however, the process was gradual. If one was in the camp that believed that negative energy zones had a sort of pseudo-sentience, it was seen as methodical. Much like a fungus, the physical or ethereal manifestation of an undead being was the fruit of a much greater process. They were something like the drones of insectoid races that would autonomously go out and find sustenance for the hive, except in this case the hive was the negative energy zone and the sustenance was the generation of more negative energy through the mindless hunger of the undead. Unfortunately, unlike any living hive, that sustenance stuck around. Ambient negative energy remained in an area until it was cancelled out. Beings generated in a negative energy zone didn't consume negative energy to manifest or fuel their continued existence. Fortunately, reaching the point at which Death Knights and Soul Eaters might manifest required a negative energy zone in a grievously advanced stage of development. Which brought them to their current conundrum. If the Katsa Plains was as large as Wintermoon had stated, it would produce its fair share of elder liches, vampires and anything else that belonged in its inverted ecology. Something of the magnitude of a Death Knight, however, should have only appeared once a century or so. Yet, the reports of Roland Gork's warrior clans claimed at least dozens. On its own, it didn't make much sense. What are the chances of a foothold situation? Soraka said to no one in particular. What's that? Rana Saj asked from the bench in front of him. Basically, Soraka answered, this Katsa Plains northwest of the Draconic Kingdom is far too small to have so many powerful undead. But there does exist a place with a lot of powerful undead. Elder liches are fairly common as far as stronger undead are concerned. They all learn teleportation magic because, well, who wouldn't learn such convenient magic if they could? Anyway, it is the fear of any country aware of the dangers of the undead that an elder lich or several of them teleports an undead warband straight into their territory, establishing a foothold. If it was a foothold scenario, it might actually work in the Beastman Confederacy's favor. They would be perfectly justified in sending an expeditionary force to put a permanent end to the threatened station that army in the ruins of the Draconic Kingdom. Once established, they could fix the barbarism and stupidity that was going on in the savage lands around it. What's teleportation? Rana Saj asked. It describes an effect that instantaneously moves a caster or the caster's target from one place to another. It can be a spell, ability, skill, or even martial art. Soraka tried thinking of any races Roland Gork might be familiar with that had some form of innate teleportation, but from what he could recall, there were none. You may have witnessed some of my Gladestalkers doing it in battle, Soraka said, but the version I was referring to can cover hundreds of kilometers in a single cast. That does sound convenient, Rana Saj said. It could indeed explain how so many powerful undead could suddenly appear. The problem is that undead don't behave that way, Karawaki said from Soraka's left. I won't claim that they're unimaginative, but their thinking flows along certain lines. An elder lich learns teleportation for personal use, they never offer someone a ride. Arcane might is a mark of personal accomplishment and they jealously guard their powers. More importantly, Soraka said, the undead are not strategically or tactically flexible. Elder liches can control many undead, but their tactics are generally not much better than what mindless undead are capable of. The main difference is that all those mindless undead move according to a single will. Vampire lords form secretive covens that they treat as exclusive clubs for the privileged. Mummy lords act as the high priests of their temples or tombs. The closest thing to a commander that the undead have are Death Knights, which aren't any better than an unproven, untrained youth with an unblooded warband. So the thought of using this teleportation for strategic advantage never enters into their minds. Yes, that's right. Thankfully, massed undead walk wherever they go. Even flying one stick close to the main force. The undead gaining a true grasp of strategy is possibly one of the greatest threats to the living world. As Voltava so succinctly put it, What was. Every species of undead had its own behaviors and, in lieu of the desires of the living, they pursued their objectives with a single-minded obsession. Not only did this narrow their options, but it also resulted in varying rates of growth between different types of intelligent undead. The somewhat common Elder Lich manifested as a relatively weak being. Like any magic caster who focused on their studies, however, they could grow in knowledge and power in seclusion and secrecy. Mummies were in a similar boat, though they weren't as busy as priests who tended to the living for obvious reasons. Vampires tended to take a more social route. They couldn't fit in with the living well when they were lesser vampires, so they acted as wandering predators until they were destroyed or evolved into a form more suited to their goals. Once that happened, they infiltrated a society of their choice. As it was infiltration, it became much more difficult to deal with, but at the same time didn't create major, overt problems for the living until the coven grew to an advanced stage. Intelligent undead of the martial variety, on the other hand, faced a mountain of difficulties. Beings such as Death Knights manifested at a level of strength where the vast majority of opponents they encountered were relatively weak and offered little in the way of growth opportunities. Most countries were intelligent enough to give them a wide berth until they could be decisively dealt with. No one wanted to inadvertently make one of the undead stronger if they could help it, so Death Knights, Soul Eaters, and the like tended to see little development by the time they were destroyed. Since the undead from the Katsa Plains hadn't been running rampant over the region for an extended period, Soraka expected that the Elder Liches and potential Night Liches in the oncoming undead army were the preeminent threat. But even those would likely be fairly straightforward in their thinking and highly limited in combat experience. The information delivered to Rolengork's warrior clans supported this notion, with the undead simply massing in overwhelming numbers and taking the path of least resistance, and through the most highly populated areas of the Rolengork Basin. Their barge made its way through the familiar canyon that marked the entrance to the Draconic Kingdom, part of a vast fleet of vessels ferrying the warrior clans of Rolengork to confront their foe in the west. Every warrior clan not occupied with border duties had answered the call to arms. This included the already battered, but still powerful, Clan Kira, which sent 40,000 with Rana Saj. Strangely, Soraka hadn't been aware of just how prominent the clan was, and he cringed a bit when he thought about how he was trying to introduce Short to them. Her reaction to his nonchalant attempts was understandable, given how many steps on the social ladder he had skipped. "How are things being organized at the landing?" Soraka asked. "Probably chaotically," Rana Saj answered. "We know how to run an army, but this army is 20 times larger than usual. Fortunately, this place that we're arriving at." "Eastwatch," Mitra said. "Eastwatch," Rana Saj repeated, then furrowed his brow. "That's funny, Gaulia has the same meaning. I guess we'll be stationed at the Eastern Watches, even this far west. Anyway, the Rolengork has two major tributaries joining it near Eastwatch, and the clans are disembarking along both the Rolengork and the northern one." Soraka nodded. At least they wouldn't be split in half if they lost control of the river. With things as hectic as they were, he did his best to stay out of Rana Saj's way and simply act as an informal attaché. There was little detailed information about the undead to be had, so the standard-looking deployment that the clan lords decided on was one of the better stances to assume, both defensively and logistically. The silhouette of the human fortress city appeared through the rain, and their barge maneuvered to a berth reserved for Rana Saj in the city's harbor. There, a warrior awaited him, bobbing his head respectfully as the clan lord disembarked. "Rana Saj," he said. "Welcome. A place has been prepared for you and your retinue. Please follow me." They fell into step behind their warrior, making their way up the broad ramp to the fortress gate. "Any developments on the front?" Rana Saj asked. "Too many to list," the warrior said. "The clan lords that have already arrived are discussing them in the hold. Once we settle the matter of your warriors, I'm to deliver you to the hold so you can join in on the shouting." "That sounds promising. I won't deny that it's a mess. Too many things have happened too quickly." The warrior led them through the inner walls of the city, bringing them up to a manor that looked like it had been converted into a barracks. After examining the structure for a bit longer, he decided that it was purpose-built to be easily convertible. It showed good sense on the part of the humans, as the fortress city probably took in refugees from the countryside and temporarily housed additional soldiers on a regular basis. Under the eaves of the entrance, they found a tall, young bar who stepped out into the rain as soon as he noticed them. "Father," he said. "Hurl." Ranasaj strode forward and wrapped his son up in a hug. "Thank the gods you're safe." Ranasaj released Hurl, patting him up and down as if to ensure the boy was still in one piece. "Is Goro inside? He's usually taking a nap at around this time." Hurl looked down at the paving stones in silence. His ears and whiskers drooped, and his tail lay flat over the lane. "I see." Ranasaj's tone was measured. "Our warriors need to be situated first. We'll speak on the way to the hold." Once they received the arrangements for their disembarking warriors, their guide led them to the keep in the rear central portion of the inner city. Ranasaj and his son walked together in silence until the bar lord visibly gathered himself. "So," he said, "what happened?" "We were stationed far in the northwest," Hurl said, "for a poor civilian clan of Singh that called themselves Kisha. Well, it was mostly out of charity. They were tributaries of Clan Torika, but the conquest had turned out far differently than expected. We were just there to help out, and, Goro being Goro, he wanted to go as far as he could go to see what things were like out here." That did sound like how Soraka's father described Goro. He was a bar that wished to travel far and wide to see the world and all of its wonders. "Our tasks mainly consisted of border duties," the young bar continued. "Both guarding Clan Kisha's territory against intrusion and keeping the humans from escaping the country. Our warband ended up in a place that the humans call the Dead March - a vast grassland bordering another place that the humans call the Katza Plains. That place was the likes of which I had never seen before, an endless wasteland devoid of all life, cracked and blasted by the elements. An impenetrable mist shrouds everything, and within that mist lurk the undead. Still, things were uneventful for months. There were no problems from the outside while the issues experienced by the civilian clans only grew worse. At least until about 8 weeks ago, when our scouts detected the first signs of the undead horde. They were plentiful, but weak. Our warriors had never fought any undead before, but we could easily best many times our number. Yet, Goro sensed that there was something wrong, that something else was going on. In that case, Ranasaj said, he must have advised the clan lord accordingly. "He did," Hurl replied. "But the clan lord wouldn't listen. Too many things kept them from heeding grandfather's wisdom. The conquest was too easily achieved, and the civilian clans had become undeservingly prideful. Because the conquest was too easily achieved, there were too many mouths to feed and a battle would kill off the unworthy. And because their lands were won through conquest, defending their prize from those that would challenge them for it was a matter of course." "I could empathize with their reasoning if they were a warrior clan," Ranasaj said, "but this clan Kisha was purely civilians, right? Clan Torika's information described threats that were clearly beyond the capabilities of a civilian clan to handle." "Those threats weren't there at first," Hurl told him. "What we saw were weak undead, skeletons, zombies, wights, ghouls and the like. The others must have been deeper in their ranks, out of the notice of our scouts." "Is that how Goro fell, then? Bested by an unexpected foe?" "I don't know," Hurl sighed. "Goro was so convinced that something terrible was happening that he sent me to warn the others. All of Clan Kisha was on the warpath when I parted ways with Goro, and our warband was obliged to support them." Silence settled over father and son. There was little sense of closure in the tale. Only bitterness. "Goro sent you to warn the others," Soraka said, "but what we heard in Rolengork made the appearance of the undead sound like a complete surprise." "Because the others wouldn't listen," Hurl grated. I just lacked the means to persuade them. I could only convey Goro's misgivings. I couldn't just lie and say that Clan Kisha had been destroyed. And all those clans along the way were much like Clan Kisha. They had the same reasons to stay, and those reasons were more compelling than a vague warning about an unproven threat. Maybe if Thurgok had been sent instead of me. "Now that you mention it," Ranasaj said, "I recall that girl went off chasing after you. Did she catch up with Goro's warband?" "She did," another sigh left Hurl's voice. "I protested when Goro allowed her to join us, but he just laughed and told me to resign myself to my fate." Chuckles rose from the warriors around them, but they didn't last for long. "The last I saw of her," Hurl said, "she was in one of the border patrols. She would have joined our warband with Clan Kisha in the furthest northwest. No one survived from there, except me." "You can't blame yourself for that, son," Ranasaj said. Neither should you blame yourself for all those stubborn clans that couldn't be persuaded to abandon their new territories. What Soraka said is still valid, however. The civilian clans may not have heeded your warning, but Clan Toraka should have. What did Ranadratha say when you brought word to him? Kroll stopped in the middle of the street. Ranasaj spun around to face him, returning his son's confused expression with one of his own. What are you talking about, father? The youth said, Ranadratha is dead. He's been dead for over half a year. Well, Jiraka snorted. That explains a whole lot. It certainly did. A war master would never knowingly make the mistakes that were on clear display in the Draconic Kingdom. How could that happen? Ranasaj said incredulously. Ranadratha was peerless in both tactics and strategy. Not even our best warriors could defeat him in personal combat. I'm still not sure, exactly, Roll said. Goro said that he was leading an assault against a stubborn human holdout. There was no sign of any sort of trap. A score of powerful humans simply appeared out of thin air and attacked the War Master all at once, slaying him, his bodyguards, and several prominent lords. A teleport ambush, Soraka said grimly. That's teleportation? Ranasaj's mouth fell open. The lands beyond the edge of civilization were truly brutal. Even the slightest edge in ability, knowledge, magic, or technology could lay the mighty low through all of their precautions. Nations didn't enjoy free-flowing connections, nor did they have any decent degree of communication or development, and that made the situation orders of magnitude worse. It is a well-known martial application of teleportation, Soraka said. At least where I come from. A force can be teleported to a certain, predetermined point to decisively strike at whoever or whatever is lured to it. Without any true countermeasures, the target can only fight for their survival, which would be difficult considering their ambushers will have made the appropriate preparations to deal with them. Ranasaj looked around as if something might pop up to strike at him then and there. The attack was sudden, Roll said, but the assassins were known to us. They were killed in retaliation not long after. Not that it would have made up for the War Master's loss, Ranasaj muttered. In that case, who leads Clan Toraka now? Which Viper decided that deceiving one's people over such a critical matter was even remotely a good idea? Ranadratha's mate. A guru by the name of Khshschlr. Soraka resisted the urge to cover his face with his paw. I never liked her, Ranasaj said. Too many ideas. I suppose that this was another one of them. They arrived at the central keep, a massive structure with basalt battlements looming 10 meters over the street. As their guide had mentioned, the sound of shouting could be heard leaking out of the arrow slits above. With a dead War Master on their hands, Soraka couldn't blame them. The brilliant leader that they thought they would have was no longer. The shouts coming down the stairwell died down when Ranasaj entered the great hall on the 3rd floor of the keep. Ranasaj, a massive Sing Lord near the head of the table said. Going by the way your tail is hanging, you've learned of the War Master's fate. Going by all the shouting, Ranasaj replied, it seems that a new order hasn't been established. How can there be? Never have so many clans gone to war in one place at once. Even the Yorgulan front only maintains 300,000 at any one time. Nothing says it can't be the same way, Ranasaj seemed to shrug as he took his place across from the Sing Lord. The Yorgulan front has no war master, the warrior clans of the east simply take their respective turns defending the border. At the least, each major clan or coalition of minor clans can take care of their respective portions of the fight against the undead. Ranasaj sat down, placing his paws on the table. The lords that had just been standing as they shouted at one another followed suit. Most of us are of the same mind, Ranakjura said. The problem lies with deployment. Reports from the front have been sporadic and mostly hysterical. Borderline superstitious, and we don't even have any superstitions about the undead. I'm not sure if they can be trusted or not. You mean to say that they imply Clan Toraka is losing? Losing ground, at least. From what we can put together, the undead control the Rolengork further west and Clan Toraka's forces have been cut in half. Those that we spoke to, it's as if fighting the undead was a routine thing for 2 weeks, and then it suddenly wasn't. So they were caught off guard, Ranasaj said. Who is commanding Clan Toraka's forces now, by the way? If you say it's that guru, I'm afraid this table may not survive my reaction. Snorts of derision sounded from around the long stone table. Evidently, Khhschlr wasn't very well liked amongst Rolengork's clanlords. When they had first arrived in the jungle, his wives had mentioned how the elites of the tribal confederation were likely the conservative sort. Back then, he considered it a downside. With Khhschlr in the picture, maybe it was actually a good thing. Rana Renatha, Rana Kjura said. A Overlord. Under him are Rana Veri and Rana Kimb, who commanded the north and south sides of the Rolengork respectively. They've been the de facto military leaders since the loss of Rana Dritha, and it at least sounded like they were holding out back when they first reported the appearance of this undead army. Considering the whole thing with Rana Dritha, I'm not sure if any information can be trusted. They could have been fighting the undead for the past year for all we know. Goro's warband was in the northwest when the undead first appeared, Rana Saj said. My son was with them, and he said that was about 8 weeks ago. I see. Well, that's one less thing to have doubts over. What spurred the undead advance? Rana Saj asked. Why did they even stop in the first place? From what I understand, the undead don't stop for anything if the living stand before them. Rana Kjura's gaze went past Rana Saj's shoulder, to Soraka. It should be the elder liches mentioned in the initial reports coordinating their forces, the Singh Lord said. The way your friend described them at our meeting in Khorstorofi Keral, they were probably just waiting for enough forces to push Clan Toraka back decisively. Still, Soraka said, even that is a cause for worry. Are the undead using any discernible tactics or indirect strategies? As far as we've heard, it's been entirely direct. They'll even destroy their own to get at the living. When force doesn't work, they use more force. What about their control of the river? Likely an unfortunate fact of how their progress varies on the resistance that we offer. The undead get stalled at the cities and towns wherever Clan Toraka makes a stand and they rampage unchecked everywhere else. We can't offer any resistance underwater, so. Did that make sense? On the surface, it did. There was a certain foolishness in overcomplicating things, but, at the same time, there was a danger to dismissing things as being as simple as they appeared. How close are the undead now? Rana Saj asked. The renewed undead advance started 8 days ago, Rana Kjura answered. Rana Ver's forces at first intended to hold the undead back at one of the human cities on the front, but then they realized that the undead all along the front were simply advancing past them. They changed the plan to a fighting retreat to avoid being encircled, but there were complications. The undead had gotten past them by way of the river and they couldn't use ships to send their civilians to safety as they intended. The warrior clans tried holding the undead back while escorting the civilians, but when exhaustion started taking the civilians. Soraka shook his head. It was a colossal tragedy. One that played right into the undead's cold, rotting hands. Those that were unfamiliar with the tactics of the undead tended to think it was their hate-filled violence and supernatural abilities that made them a threat, but, in reality, it was what they represented. Disease, infirmity, age, exhaustion. They were the manifestation of the fate that awaited all mortals, and they relied on those means to create more of their own. How many are we facing now? He asked. Too many to count, Rana Kjura answered. We already have skirmishers chipping away at them in the north, where they've advanced to the border of Rolengork. I believe we've been successful at drawing them towards us instead of heading into the jungle. What about their controllers? The Elder Liches and Death Knights. A few Elder Liches did fly out, at first. Our hunters gave them a good pummeling, so they're probably a bit shy about making an appearance now. The rest of the undead front on the north side of the Rolengork are anywhere between 1 and 2 days away. Clan Toraka's original plan was to hold the undead at their clanhold, so the ones on the south side are probably behind. Which makes it the perfect opportunity to get rid of the northern undead forces, an Osalo Lord said. We should seize this chance before the two halves consolidate. They may have cut Clan Toraka's forces in half, but in doing so they have divided themselves as well. It was a fundamentally sound line of reasoning, but he didn't like moving without knowing where the other half of the undead forces were. There was no reason that he shouldn't know, however. Karawaki. Yes? Locate the other half of the undead forces. As you command. The Sacred Claw went about making her preparations with the others. 6 stoops were placed in a line on the dais at the head of the room. What are they doing? Rana Saj asked. Scrying for the location of the enemy forces in the south, Soraka answered. It's a brute force method that doesn't have any success in locating unknown individuals, but a horde of undead is easily spotted. The mystics attending to the lords in the room came forward to watch the proceedings curiously. The lords came forward as well, gaping at the scenery flashing by and the watery reflection of each stoop. "I have something," one of the sacred claws said. "Already?" Soraka strode forward. "Don't tell me the undead are under a kilometer away from here." "You may wish that they were," the sacred claw replied. "This is something arguably worse." Soraka placed his paws on his hips, leaning forward to look into the water's reflection. He immediately wished he hadn't. In the projected image was a large group of beastmen. Carried on the back of one of the warriors in the front was KHHSCHLR,